coming. 90-degree Sunday afternoon. I know there are probably some other things on your schedule that were above this, but I really appreciate you being here, and it's really great to see so many people. I'll start off by explaining a little bit about myself and why I'm running, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. The beauty I found in running for office is that it's a constant conversation. And so if you have any thoughts or any comments, please feel free to jump in. I was born and raised in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I graduated from Hershey High School, where my brother and I led our basketball team to their first Mid-Penn championship in 20 years, which is, for better or worse, still one of my proudest accomplishments. And I went on to Dickinson College in Carlisle, where initially I wanted to teach and coach. A lot of my mentors, a lot of the people that I looked up to were teachers and coaches, and I thought that I wanted to do the same. And I played basketball there as well. That changed for me my junior year when I took a class with Judge John Cherry, who some of you may know. Judge Cherry at the time was the juvenile judge in the Dauphin County Court of Common Pleas. And he was teaching a juvenile law class at Dickinson. And at the time, the Kids for Cash scandal in Luzerne County was very recent. And for those of you who don't know, the Kids for Cash scandal involved two judges sending juveniles to institutional facilities, receiving kickbacks worth millions of dollars over the better part of 2 decades. And these juveniles didn't have a lawyer, they weren't sent with due process. And I saw, really for the first time, what happens when the law becomes corrupted. What happens when those who are discharged with the law abuse that power. And I decided to go to law school. And so I spent the next year in Judge Cherry's courtroom, learning as much as I could from him, and was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to Penn State Law, where I just had an incredible experience, and I would do it over 1,000 times. I was voted by my classmates to speak at commencement. I was inducted into the Order of the Barristers, which is a group for excellence in advocacy. I published on a number of issues when I was there, and was the only student in the country invited to present in Washington, D.C. with the FCC on cybersecurity. After law school, I was the first Penn State law student in the school's history to accept a clerkship on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, which of course is just a notch below the Supreme Court. And I really think it's the best possible education I could have had. We heard cases from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey, from Delaware, and actually our jurisdiction included the Virgin Islands as well. And I had a hand in writing precedential opinions that remain on the books and that affect millions of people. And it was just an incredible experience. After my clerkship, I was recruited by an international law firm in Philadelphia to join their litigation department. And the main reason I went there really was because the firm, Blank Rome, gave their lawyers the opportunity to work over 100 billable pro bono hours, which meant that we could take on free legal representation, and that would be included in our billable rate, and that was unheard of in Philadelphia. It was the most in the city. And so when I was there, I worked with the Senior Law Center on promulgating a Bill of Rights that the city of Philadelphia is now implementing for senior citizens. I spent my Tuesday afternoons working with elementary students. My mom is a reading specialist, and she's shown me the value of teaching young students to read, and so I spent every Tuesday doing the same and working with young students on their reading skills. And I just had an incredible experience at Blank Rome. Over the course of these 3 years, I've really done the best that I could to understand the issues that we face. Over those 5 years, I've published in reputable journals and newspapers on cybersecurity, on biotechnology, on the government's ability to access our data, on immigration, on public corruption, on foreign affairs. Every issue that we face today has been one that I've really done my best to understand. And what I'm most proud of is a book I wrote last year. And part of the reason I was able to write a book was because my clerkship was in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I was single, and I didn't have a lot to do. And so after watching the 76ers play basketball every night at the same location, I thought, you know what, I should probably do something better with my time. And it was kind of serendipitous, actually. I came across a quote from Abraham Lincoln. He was 23 years old at the time, and he was speaking to a group of young people. And he said that in order to maintain America's proud fabric of freedom, we must revisit the story of our founding as often as we read the Bible. And that was his way of saying that unless we understand why a group of young people would revolt, literally sacrifice their lives for something that had never existed in human history, we will lose the essence of democracy. We have to understand why this happened. And so over the course of the better part of a year, I went back and I read about the ideological origins of the revolution and the founders' philosophy of government, and tried as best I could to understand what the essence of the Constitution was intended to be. And the more I did that, the more apparent it became to me how far off track we've gotten from what our forebears envisioned. In Pennsylvania today, we have the most opioid deaths per day in the country. I've lost 3 high school teammates to opioid addiction, 2 in the past 12 months. It's devastating. We have the highest student loan rate in the entire country. We have the highest African American unemployment in the country. Our infrastructure ranks 48th. 40% of people can't afford a $400 healthcare bill. 70% of Pennsylvanians don't have a dime saved for retirement. Life expectancy is in decline for the 3rd straight year. Teenage anxiety has increased 350% in the past 3 years. Suicide rates have doubled. The moral fabric of our country is unraveling each and every day. And it's not just domestic issues. We look at what's happening internationally right now. Foreign affairs, I think, for the first time since the end of the Iraq War, has come to the forefront of our political discourse, and I think rightly so. In January of this year, President Trump backed out of the INF nuclear treaty with Russia. It took 50 years, from President Truman to President Reagan. It marked the end of the Cold War in 1987. It marked the end of nuclear proliferation in Europe. And the very next day, Vladimir Putin was out testing hypersonic nuclear weapons. North Korea just launched a missile over Japan. We're currently selling nuclear technology to the Saudis, which CNN just reported yesterday, that is now in the hands of Iranian rebels. Autocracies on the rise in Turkey, in Venezuela, in Hungary, in Russia, in China. Everywhere we look, the idea of democracy is once again being questioned. My brother's in the army, and it horrifies me. It's awful. And so, I think once again we've returned to the question that was presented in 1776 of whether a nation like this can endure. In 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt accepted his party's nomination for the presidency in Philadelphia by memorably saying, and I wrote it down, that there is a mysterious cycle in human events. Of some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. I think the same can be said for us. We too have a rendezvous with destiny. And as was the case 3 years ago when President Roosevelt spoke those words, a sinister shadow of fear is spreading across the world. And we meet today at a time of tolerance and of tyranny, in a decade of yes we can and lock her up, in an age of rapid scientific progress and rapid moral decline. And I believe that the politics of old are fundamentally not up to the challenges that we face. Perched on the event horizon right now are unprecedented challenges: radical inequality, surveillance capitalism, a global climate crisis, an unremitting threat of biological and nuclear weapons. It falls on us. And these challenges will not be answered by politicians who seek power. but by citizens who seek justice, not by rhetoric that peddles a willingness to fight, but by compassion that longs to understand, and not by individuals who settle for the status quo, but by a generation that is ready and able to take bold risks. And I think that's the essence of our question. In short, what's at stake is not the leadership of our district, or our commonwealth, or our country. What's at stake is our right to the moral leadership of our planet. And as FDR once said, public service is preeminently a place of moral leadership. And a moral leader governs not by vanity, but by conscience, asking always, is this right? Our challenge stems from the fact that we have lost the ideals that form the basis of our national greatness: compassion, integrity, honor, and truth. They've been rendered hollow by self-interested politicians who would prefer personal ambition over the common good. Exhibit A is Scott Perry. The man is everything I aspire not to be. And I think the perfect illustration of who Scott Perry is as a person is this anecdote. And I'm sure many of you know it already, but on November 4th of last year, right before the general election, Scott Perry published an op-ed in the Patriot News in which he promised and pledged to protect coverage for pre-existing conditions. In May of this year, he violated that promise by voting against the Pre-Existing Conditions Coverage Act of 2019. That is flagrant deceit. And that's the type of politics that Scott Perry represents. My primary opponent in the Democratic race, Eugene D. Pasquale, I think represents a similar problem that we face in politics today. It's a failure of moral leadership. When he was a state rep, he voted for an unconstitutional gerrymandering bill that sacrificed the voting rights of every single person in this room for a decade. Think about that. Who does that? Who is so willing to sacrifice the common good for personal ambition that they willingly vote for something that takes away the right to vote for millions of people? And it's not just my opinion, really. If you go back and you read the Journal and the Democratic leaders who were on the floor during the debate, the debate of the gerrymandering bill, they said, and this is a quote from Greg Vitale, who spoke after about a dozen Democrats on the House floor: I lay a challenge to the citizens of Pennsylvania. By voting for this bill, we are ignoring them. We are saying that we don't care what you want, and we're doing what's best for us as politicians. We don't care what you as citizens of Pennsylvania want, and so what are you going to do about it? We have a chance with this election to do something about it. It's our legacy. It's our responsibility. The last stop for Donald Trump in 2016 was our district, Hershey, Pennsylvania, my hometown. The very place where Milton and Kitty Hershey built a school for orphans was hijacked by someone who puts immigrants in cages. All of us in this room have a responsibility to act. And I think by doing so, we can achieve what the very mission of this group is: restoring genuinely representative and forward-thinking government to central Pennsylvania. That's what this group is about. And we don't have a choice. And so I think the issue in this election is whether this new and exciting path will commence today, or if we'll return to the stale, dank atmosphere of the status quo. It's the issue that you must decide in 2020. It's the issue that our country must decide. And that's why I'm running. It's not simply to be a congressman, although I'd like to serve. It's not simply because I have ideas that I believe can move this country forward. though I do, it's because I believe that my candidacy represents something different. It's the opportunity to restore values and integrity, and once again get this country moving. And so, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here. I mean it sincerely when I say that I have the utmost respect for the people in this room who go out of their way to do democracy the right way. Because without people like you, who knows what the future would hold? Each of us has an obligation as a citizen to do something, and especially at the moment that we're in today. And I mean it when I say thank you.
Got time for questions? I'm sure somebody has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Pryor, for your remarks. Michael, I just wanted to ask you more specifically, what do you think the three biggest issues facing our district are?
Healthcare. Oh, should I can take the mic back. Sorry, I'm still learning.
If you speak loudly, I think they can hear you in the back.
Yeah.
Or if we ask
Why
questions
don't
loudly,
you
you can
speak
Okay.
and see what they can hear? Go ahead.
Everybody hear me? I should probably get good at this, huh? Healthcare, I think, is number one. Everyone I talk to when I go canvassing, when I go meet with groups of people, is a genuine and fearful concern about the ability to afford quality healthcare. And I think that's number one. And I think especially with somebody like Scott Perry in the House right now, who is proactively trying to take that away, that has to be a top priority. The second is jobs. I think the unemployment numbers right now are misleading. And if we look deeper, we would see the fact that almost 40% of the working class in Pennsylvania right now works in the gig economy, for Uber, for Lyft, for Airbnb. They have no retirement savings. They have no healthcare benefits. They work on a day-to-day basis without any upward trajectory. And I think you combine that with the fact that we're not training people for the jobs of the future. And I think if you look 10 years down the line from now, I don't think we're prepared for what's coming, especially with the rate of technological change that we're in today. And I think the third is student loans. The average student loan rate in Pennsylvania right now is $38,000 per student. That number is even higher for people who are 60 years and older, because the interest rates on Direct Plus loans have now skyrocketed to 12, 13, 14%. They're impossible to pay off. And so when I think you look at the structural issues that we have today, it's things like that that are preventing people from getting ahead. And so it's quality health care, high-paying jobs, which includes raising the minimum wage to $15 at the very least, and fixing the student loan crisis and giving folks the opportunity to get ahead.
Two issues. One, where do you stand on a woman's right to choose? And two, what about our tax situation where money was funneled to the top 1%? And I know many of us and our families paid more last year than we did the previous year.
On your first question,
Can you guys hear? Can you hear? It'd be better for
I can repeat it. First question was, where do I stand on a woman's right to choose? I'll preface it by saying I was raised in a Roman Catholic family. I respect the pro-life position, but I'm 100% in favor of a woman's right to choose. And I think it's emblematic of the larger issues we face today. We've become almost immune, I think, to the weaponization of political issues for political gain. And I think a woman's right to choose has succumbed to that. And so for me, it's not only supporting a woman's right to choose and supporting a woman's right to health care, but it's investing in child care. It's investing in early education. It's providing a stability for the child once they're born to get ahead. And so I think you can't even confine that conversation to the choice itself. You have to be able to talk more broadly about the macro issues that a woman has to face when deciding whether to have a child. And so for me, that's where I stand on that. In terms of our tax system, I think it's criminal, frankly, the tax system that's in place today. There was an article in the paper this morning that said that the national debt now has ballooned 23% in the past fiscal year, which doesn't even end until September. And I think what the Republicans are doing, and there was an article in the Atlantic where Paul Ryan basically admitted as much, is running the national debt to such a high rate that the only reaction is to cut all welfare programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the social safety net programs that people rely on every single day. I think this is by design. The national debt argument was the linchpin of the conservative movement for so long, and now all of a sudden they've abandoned it. And I think beyond that, it represents what our value system in America is today. I think we have to invert our economic conversation. So much of what we talk about in the economy is how certain measures are positive for the shareholder or for a company, despite the fact that for most of the major companies in the United States, a third of their shareholders are foreign investors. And so we've reached a situation now where the taxpayer doesn't earn a dime back on their investment. The iPhone came out of the US government. GPS came out of the Navy. Touchscreen technology came out of DARPA. Amazon wouldn't even be able to be in business today but for our interstate highway system, but for our computers, but for all these public infrastructure projects that we don't earn anything back on. And so it's the government that is subsidizing these private businesses who then take that money, go offshore, lower wages, and add to this problem of economic inequality. And so I don't think it's just the tax issue, I think it's how we look at the economy. And the emphasis for me is on restoring the investment that the public makes in these crucial issues that are in the private space, because they deserve, I think, at long last, a return on that investment.
What is your stand on impeachment, climate change, and the Green New Deal?
Anything else?
Any other hot button issues? First, impeachment, and this is something that Eugene and I disagree on. I think if you're running as a politician today, your first and really primary obligation is to stand on principle. And as somebody who's studied the Constitution now for the better part of 5 years, I will not sit by and be an idle spectator to the diminution and the destruction of the Constitution. No thanks. And so I think if you read the Mueller report, if you read what's going on right now in the executive branch, the only logical conclusion based on the Constitution is to commence impeachment inquiries. And I believe that the American people are brave enough to be told the truth of where we stand. You know, I think by avoiding this conversation, we avoid a recognition of the issues that led us to this in the first place. And so I think it's really the primary question that we should look at is where are you going to stand on principle? And that to me is the very first question. On climate change, I think it's the defining issue of our time. We're experiencing it already each and every day with these torrential downpours that are displacing homes and families and upending our economy. And I think it has to be a radical change. I've taken the position that I think the equivalent of something like a Marshall Plan that incentivizes public-private collaborations and uses the federal power of the purse to work with state and local governments to invest in clean energy is the right way to go. The Green New Deal is a little bit different from that. It has more provisions about employment and whether people who are unwilling or unable to work deserve compensation. And I think that honestly might be overstepping a bit in terms of what our goal of the climate measure should be, but I think that's the right conversation. It's not incremental change, it's radical change, and it needed to happen yesterday. And so for me, especially when I talk to young people, there's this fierce urgency of now about addressing climate change, and I don't think that conversation can fall victim to the politics of it.
I would like to congratulate you on your preparation for this job. However, I do want to know how much you know about the 10th district and the people who live here and how they think and what they want and how you win in this area that has historically been very difficult for people to know what they're doing.
Thanks. Thank you for that. It's a great question. The one thing that I've tried to do from the start is listen. It's the reason I left my job to come back here and do this full time, so I can try to meet as many people as possible and ask them what they think. And so there have been days where I spend my morning with a group of dairy farmers, or I spend my afternoons at football practice at Steelton High School, and where at night I'm at a fundraiser in Harrisburg. Each group of people is culturally dissimilar, but they all talk about the same things. They all talk about concern for family. They all talk about a concern for the future, healthcare, education, civility, civic respect. What they want is a politician, not who's going to come in and lecture them, but who's express their willingness to listen. I've had people tell me already, Republicans especially, we haven't seen a Democrat come here in 30 years. And I said, well, no wonder Democrats lose. I mean, really. The Democrats, I think their greatest flaw is that since Bill Clinton, we've ignored 30% of the voting population by design. We've essentially written them off. And so I think we have to strike a balance between meeting voters who we have this misperception that they're not going to vote Democrat, and also trying to recruit new voters. We have a ton of young people involved in our campaign. Millennials now are the largest voting bloc in the country, but we only vote at a 31% clip. We have the power to change politics if we get out when we get to the polls. And so it's trying to think of creative ways to get people involved. We're going to do a 3-on-3 basketball tournament in Harrisburg in September, where to get in you have to show your voter registration, and people are really excited about it. It's innovative ideas to get people to be civically engaged, and I think that's what you have to do to win a race like this. And so I don't purport to know everything about the district. I'm trying my best to understand. I think the benefit of having gone to Dickinson is that I have a footprint in Carlisle to some extent. I've talked with professors and folks in the community there, and it's really just listening as much as I can. But it's a constant learning process, and I don't think it's one that ever really finishes.
You don't have to walk all the way over here. I'm loud. It's good.
Well, this is a
So
recording.
you have good ideas on federally things that will help, but I'm just wondering how you feel about making real positive change here when our state legislature looks the way that it does, and what your plans are. Not asking for myself or anything, but for people who are planning to run for state leg seats next year, what can you accomplish federally that's actually going to be felt here when we have people like Daryl Metcalf and Mike Turzai?
So I'll do as much as I can to help people down the ballot. I think the benefit of running for federal office is that you have the ability to change the narrative and change the way people talk about politics and change the way the people who are involved in politics, to bring new people into the sphere. And I think that's a benefit of running for federal office. In terms of helping people down the line, I think there's a constant communication that has to take place.
Sorry, I didn't mean what are you gonna do? That would be incredibly selfish. I just mean what is actually gonna be able to make an impact here, even if something is passed in the House nationally, when we have people in Harrisburg who will not do anything to implement those, you know what I mean? If you pass a Green New Deal, that would be awesome, but Metcalf's in charge of so how do we feel here, all these great ideas that you have for DC, how do you foresee that actually coming here so we can feel the impact?
I think we have to avoid unfunded mandates, which is what the Green New Deal is, and requiring the state legislature to not give them discretion. And so I think the federal policies we implement have to be requirements, and there has to be federal funding that allows the state government to execute them. Because if we leave the discretion to state legislatures who are predominantly Republican or still adversarial to what the Democratic philosophy is, then I agree that not much will get done. And so I think that has to be a top priority. Is that a better answer?
Sorry, I wanted to clarify.
I like the breadth and depth and content of your ideas. I wish they were matched with similar breadth and depth in elective office. And I'm wondering how you plan to make up for that experiential gap.
So I think I've worked for Senator Casey now for 2 different terms in high school and college. the issues that I've studied over the past 5 years have all been federal law. I've studied from statutory law, civil law, criminal law, administrative law. I've done a deep dive in pretty much every possible issue that we face today. And frankly, I don't think there's anybody better prepared than me to hit the ground running in Congress on day one. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I've published on cybersecurity, on immigration, on biotechnology, on the Internet of Things, on foreign affairs. All the issues that we face today are things that I am fluent in. And I don't think we can have any conversation today without also bringing in technology. You know, we can't talk about mental health without talking about social media. We can't talk about jobs without talking about artificial intelligence. You know, these are issues that our politicians have to be fluent in. And I think my experience and background allows for that. And so, you know, what I lack in actual experience, I think I make up for in a studied ability to understand these issues and to hit the ground running, and at a time when the issues are novel and unprecedented. They're issues that I have experience with. And so I don't think there's anybody in the race right now, or frankly, in recent memory, who has as much relevant experience in terms of the policies that we're facing than I do.
I was just wondering your thoughts on Medicare for all. Do you support Medicare for all? Do you think there's another solution, single payer?
I think if we had to start the healthcare system over from scratch, then a single payer would probably be the way to go. I don't think it's a practical solution based upon the infrastructure that we have in place right now. You know, I don't think we've ever actually seen the ACA implemented to its full extent. Pretty much from day one, the Republicans have defunded it and taken away every positive measure that was enacted in the first place. And so instead of overhauling the system overnight, which I think Medicare for all is perfectly valid of an argument as to how to fix the healthcare system. But I think there are multiple steps that precede that we should take first. And so that's trying to reform the ACA, perhaps providing a robust public option and seeing if that creates or fixes some of the problems that exist. And if none of that works, then maybe Medicare for all is the answer. But in terms of where we're at right now, I don't see that as being the most immediate solution.
There's a lot of money in politics, and we know that it's probably going to take, close to $1 million to run for this district. It seems that you've got to get a head start on this as well, but that also brings up the paradox of money in politics.
Right.
So, you say you get elected, then what are you going to do to take money out of politics?
So I've already taken the corporate PAC pledge. I've promised not to take a dime of corporate money. Again, that's something that differentiates not only Scott Perry and I, but Eugene and I, who's taken money from Comcast and AT&T for his entire career. I think if you really want to change the system, you have to walk the walk. You can't take corporate money, and you have to make campaign finance reform a top issue, because none of these issues that we've even discussed today are going to be reformed unless we get money out of politics. It's the reality of our situation. And I was actually speaking with Congressman J.P. Sarbanes of Maryland recently. He's the longest standing member of the House of Representatives who has not taken a dime of corporate money. He's essentially the author of H.R. 1, which is the most progressive campaign finance bill we've seen in our history. And he said that has to be a priority. And so for me, when I get into the House, it's going to be the same. We have to get money out of politics. Teddy Roosevelt called it the corruption of the electorate, and I agree. And it's the reason why from day one I've decided not to take any corporate money.
Anybody else? Going once. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Really.
Thanks, everybody. So if you'd like to get involved in the campaign, which we'd love to have you, we have some volunteer forms to fill out up here, whether it's just knocking on doors, canvassing, doing phone banks, perhaps hosting a fundraiser or a meet and greet. You're welcome to fill one of these out. You can even take a button if you'd like. We're still working on our literature. I found it very difficult to find a union printing shop in this area, and so we hopefully will have that this week. Otherwise, I would have had that for you as well. But we'd love to have your involvement in the campaign. We already have over 200 volunteers already, and there's a genuine energy with this campaign. And we're trying to do it in a grassroots way. And so if you'd like to join in on that, we'd love to have you.
And your website?
BrierForCongress.com. It's not spelled like the ice cream. It's B-R-I-E-R.